So, how does a monarch, a guy known as the King of Kings who ruled for almost 40 years, end up as a stateless wanderer, completely rejected by his former allies? Today, we're going to dive into the incredibly dramatic and chaotic final 18 months in the life of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the very last Shah of Iran. Let's start with the date, January 16th, 1979. On this one cold day, a monarchy that had lasted for 2,500 years, the peacock throne of Persia. It all effectively just ends. But the story of the man who last sat on that throne? His story was far from over. Here you see the Shah and Empress Farah at Mehrabad Airport. The official story to the world was that this was just a temporary vacation, a short trip to let things cool down back home. But in reality, this was the first step into an exile that would never end. He would never, ever see his homeland again. All right, so let's start right there with those first moments of his departure as he was leaving behind an empire that was just completely falling apart. As he got on that plane, the Shah was carrying something small but incredibly powerful, a little box filled with Iranian soil. Just think about that. It was this deeply symbolic act, a king literally taking a piece of his kingdom with him, maybe because he already knew, deep down, that he was saying goodbye for the last time. So once he left Iran, the Shah's life turned into this desperate, almost frantic search for a safe place to land, just any place to call a temporary home. His odyssey started out okay, actually. He landed in Egypt and got a full state welcome from his good friend, President Anwar Sadat. From there, it was off to Morocco, then the Bahamas, and eventually Mexico. But with every single stop, you could just feel his political standing shrinking, and the welcomes got colder and colder. And this really shows you that shift perfectly. I mean, look at Egypt. He's greeted with genuine warmth and respect by Sadat. But then in Morocco, while King Hassan II did offer him refuge, the political pressure from the new government in Iran was just immense. The Shah was quickly becoming a huge political problem for anyone who helped him. And you can really feel his growing sense of hopelessness in his own words. This quote is just haunting. He was becoming a pariah, literally watching as the doors of people he once called friends and allies started slamming shut, one by one. This sense of isolation just kept building until it hit the most critical phase of his exile, a point where his own personal health crisis was about to set off a global political firestorm. And this was the fundamental question, right? The Shah wasn't just a political refugee. He was a very, very sick man. His search wasn't just for a safe place to stay anymore. It was for survival. So where on earth could he go to get the kind of advanced medical care he so desperately needed? For years, the Shah had been secretly battling this thing, this really rare and complicated type of cancer. And by 1979, his condition was going downhill fast. He had jaundice, his spleen was dangerously enlarged. He was in urgent need of super specialized treatment that you could only get in a handful of places in the entire world. Now, the Carter administration was really worried about the political fallout, but some very powerful people, guys like David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, they lobbied hard for the Shah to be let into the United States. And on October 22nd, 1979, he was allowed in on so-called humanitarian grounds. This single decision, well, it would change everything. And this is it. This is the hospital where he was treated. His presence on American soil was basically the spark that lit the fuse. Just 2 weeks after he arrived, on November 4th, angry students in Tehran stormed the U.S. Embassy, taking 52 Americans hostage. And just like that, a crisis began that would last for 444 agonizing days. I mean, the change was just so stark. Before he came to the U.S., the Shah was a political problem. Yeah. But after the embassy takeover, he became an international pariah, forever linked to the hostage crisis. He went from being an unwanted guest to a pawn in this terrifying global standoff. So, under huge pressure to get out of the U.S., his next stop was an island off the coast of Panama. Its strongman leader, Omar Torrijos, invited him. But this wasn't some peaceful sanctuary. Oh, no. The Shah was basically a prisoner, isolated, heavily guarded, and tangled up in all kinds of political games, constantly afraid he'd be sent back to Iran. It was nothing more than a gilded cage. His health was failing, his options had completely run out, and the Shah's journey was now entering its final, really somber chapter. Then, in March of 1980, one man stepped forward again, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt. He defied enormous international pressure and personally invited the dying Shah back to Cairo. Sadat welcomed his friend one last time. It was just an incredible act of personal loyalty. In Cairo, doctors tried. They performed an emergency surgery to remove his spleen, but it was just too late. Complications and infections set in after the operation, and his already weak body just started to give out. It was the one final battle he just couldn't win. In his very last days at a military hospital, he was surrounded by his family, including Empress Farah and Johanna Sadat, the wife of his incredibly loyal friend. It was a quiet, really human moment at the very end of such a public and turbulent life. And then, on July 27, 1980, at the age of 60, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi died. His 18-month, 10,000-mile journey as a king without a country was finally over. But President Sadat was absolutely determined to give his friend a funeral worthy of a king. He organized a full state funeral, a massive military procession through the streets of Cairo. It was a final, very public act of defiance and honor in a world that had pretty much turned its back. The guest list was, well, it was small, but very telling. Of course, President Sadat was there. So was former U.S. President Richard Nixon, who came as a private citizen, and Constantine II, the exiled king of Greece. A pretty small gathering of fallen leaders and a few steadfast friends. You know, maybe nothing sums up this whole final chapter better than these words from Anwar Sadat himself. When everyone else was making political calculations, Sadat's actions were guided by this simple, powerful code of personal honor, a code that tragically would play a part in his own assassination just a year later. The Shah's final journey really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When all the trappings of power are stripped away, what's actually left? What's the final measure of a life like that? Is it the power you used to have? The loyalty of the few friends who stick around? Or is it the complicated, messy legacy you leave behind for history to sort out?